final presentation of the day, kind of switching gears to a newer production practice that has a lot of people kind of really interested in thinking outside the box, right? We've had kind of setting a lot of stages of thinking through the process of transition, selecting seed, what the market's looking like. And now we're going to kind of plow ahead into the a little bit of the wild unknown about new production practices in organic that can really capture a lot of different functionality on the landscape. So with that production practice, organic 60-inch corn has had a lot of folks interested. There's been some brave folks out there trying it at scale. There's also been some research work done on it, and we've gathered together a couple producers, one from Wisconsin, one from Minnesota, right on the Minnesota-South Dakota border, that have tried organic 60-inch spaced corn at scale, and will share their individual experiences with it and give you some insight kind of from the on-the-ground level. And then that'll be John Sather and Sandy Syburg, both farmers. And then after that, after their 10 or 15 minutes or so, we're happy to welcome Dr. Joel Gruver from Western Illinois University. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him already. Organic educator and researcher in his own right. Does a lot of ground truthing of kind of newer organic practices. Has done a ton of work on tillage, cover crops, anything you can imagine, you know, in regards to organic rotations. He's looked at it. And the really interesting thing, and I think kind of the valuable thing about his particular program, is they, unlike some other research institutions, they really have to pay for their own way. So all of their, you know, farming practices are really kind of at scale and under the economic conditions that a lot of growers are under as well. So they have to make their research and their development work on the farm. So just as a reminder, everyone on the call is muted. So we do want this to have as robust of a conversation as possible. So type your questions as they come up into the chat bar below, and then be sure to select everyone, so your question is going to everyone and not one particular person. We're going to try and kind of plow through a lot of these presentations and collect questions at the end. There will be ample time at the end. We're running about 10 minutes or so behind, and all the presenters have agreed to stay on a little bit later too. So we hope this will create some great discussion farther on. If you have to leave us at 2 o'clock, I did want to mention that we do have 2 more of these remote conferences coming up in February. So February 3rd is going to be a day devoted to forages. So you will be seeing some more information about that. Similar format via Zoom with speakers, etc. So look to your email and mailbox for that. And then on February 4th, we'll have a session on small grains specifically. So just wanted to call those out here while we're getting folks ready to go. So with that, I'm going to get our next speakers unmuted here, and we will start with Sandy Syburg, owner and operator of Purple Cow Organics, farmer, educator, also seed grower. And Sandy, I think you can share your screen and take it away from there.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Okay.
Looking good.
Looking good. I know Margaret wanted to try and get a little light in the background there, so I'm moving around a little bit, so that, not that you guys want to look at my mug for sure. All right. So 60-inch corn, somewhat seriously and somewhat jokingly, you know, I said the good, the bad, and the ugly. Any Clint Eastwood fans out there will know what that all is about. But, you know, ultimately, been trying this for a few years now. Start of it was, you know, planting 60-inch corn in clean cultivated fields and interseeding. Last couple of years have been, you know, trying to do a more of a living isle approach. We farm in southeastern Wisconsin, about 400 certified organic acres, transitioning a considerable amount of additional acres starting this year. As Matt indicated, co-founder and president of Purple Cow Organics, grow a wide variety and have a pretty robust rotation. And again, the Albert Einstein's line, that the word we created right now is the process of our thinking, right? We can't change that without changing our thinking. So consider myself someone who challenges myself that way quite a bit. But this is by no means, an indication that I'm telling anybody, what to do. Our typical goals on the farm are to avoid back-to-back row crops, not following a heavy feeder with another heavy feeder, lots of cover crops and even cash crops that are smother crops, and trying to grow as much of our nitrogen as possible. So when we get into corn, this is, I'm joking when I say it's simple, right? This is kind of the way that the rotation looks on the farm. And obviously a lot of that is to do with weed management, breaking up the workload. We're a small 1.5 man operation, and I got a couple other jobs. So we've started to look at ways to potentially streamline that rotation, and corn, rye on 30-inch rows, and then looking at the rye in a 60-inch row, or the corn in a 60-inch row. But again, doing that with a living aisle. So getting some inspiration. Adam Latch, local farmer here in southeastern Wisconsin, worked and watched him do some poly cropping and some interseeding, but again, without the use of chemistry and some of the issues relative to high inputs of fertility to do that. Doing it with less off-farm inputs was really kind of a goal. And probably the greatest inspiration I had is when I located a copy of this 1961 version of the Progressive Farmer. And I wasn't aware that there were, actually rotavators that were set up to strip till and plant simultaneously. So you think back, this is 61. Yeah, and yes, that's pre-GPS. There still are people out there that can plant a straight row like that. And that's strip tilling, into a living cover and planting a crop. So that was what we, set out to do. We found an old rotavator. Clyde Mortar at Gaia Machinery and now Farm Power has been extremely helpful in that respect. And we just modified it to make it set up so that it would, make 12-inch strips in 60-inch, wide centers. And we've frost seeded the rye with clover in the spring. Harvest the rye, and then have a first year. The intention is then to have a first year clover crop, plant 60-inch corn, then move over 30 inches and do it again, which I've discussed with my certifier, and they're okay with that, because it's no different than planting corn on half the field and moving over to the other half. We've done mowing the clover first, and then putting the strips in, and we've done the opposite of that. Put the strips in, planted, and then mowed afterward. Really haven't found any significant difference. What I do in my 30-inch corn, and then my go-to variety for several years now has been the Ultra Pure 08495. We set our planter. We had to trick it obviously to get the same population that we would in 30-inch rows. We're running a liquid in furrow, biological, along with a sugar product out of QLF, a dry fertilizer, 2x as a starter. We planted this corn on June 1st. Been using just our straight conventional equipment, with shutting off every other row as we plant. Haven't ventured into actually setting up, any true 60-inch planters yet, but if things keep going this way, that's probably what we would do. Again, this is what the field looks like, at planting time. We had a spring that was more of a clover spring than a corn spring. Emergence was okay. You can see here that I've got some work to do to improve the strip tilling to get a cleaner edge on those strips. But overall, things were looking pretty good early on, and then we stayed cold and wet, and it started to look like this, and it was scary. So hence the good, the bad, and the ugly part of it. It did come around, but again, we had way more growth on the clover and a fair setback on the corn. About a month after this picture was taken, we were actually considering taking the crop as a silage crop instead of taking it all the way to grain. At the end of the day, it looked better than it could be. First year clover is certainly something that we've been managed, is managed differently than the second year clover. So I've got some learning to do there. We ended up harvesting it with a grain table. Corn was pretty short. I think that population probably hurt us. We dried up for about 3 weeks this year. So we've got some work to do from the hybrid choice as well as plant population, and even, some of what we're going to use for that living aisle. Again, the living aisle is something that has been being done in vegetable production for a long time. So real quick, what I've learned, managing that second year clover has to be done very differently than first year clover, cleaning up those edges on the strips. Plan to trial some different clover combinations. There's some short growing clovers that have been brought to my attention by some people at the UW. I think we're going to have to play around with some corn varieties and probably populations, and then even possibilities of using perennials instead of clover. These real low growing, sort of highly durable, steppable type crops like dichondra. Not sure how I did on my time. My stopwatch stopped on me over here, but trying to speed through it. Lots of pictures, and I'll be sticking around till the very end for any questions, comments, etc.
Sure. Well, maybe while you're right on here, I think this is a pertinent question based on what you just said. So first year clover versus second year clover. Can you maybe explain how that worked?
Well, I think that, in the first year clover, it was easier to kill, easier to set back, and it definitely didn't compete. When we dried up this year, that really robust clover crop competed pretty heavily for moisture, with the corn crop.
This was clover that you underseeded with a small grain, and then the first year clover would be that same seeding year. Second year would be the following year, correct?
Correct. So it was a pretty solid stand of really, really robust clover, that we stripped into for the second year. I didn't get into a lot of details on corn yields, but ultimately in that rotation that I had with a 6-year rotation, trying to get, when corn was $8 or $10 a bushel, not necessarily now following the Mercaris guy, but the reality is that, the desire was to potentially get another corn phase and, have 2 corn phases in a 7-year rotation instead of 1 in a 6.
You want to share what your yields were on that particular piece?
Pardon me?
You want to share what your yields were on that particular piece?
Yeah, so first year clover, we were pretty close to our 30-inch corn at just a few bushels over 200 bushels an acre. And this year, when, as I said, it was really starting to look like it was a disaster, like a crash and burn. And at the end of the day, it still, made 108 bushel on that field that I had the pictures of. So I think ultimately, with a really low cost of production, very low inputs, gone from 8 field operations to get 30-inch corn planted, tine weeded, rotary hoed, cultivated, to only 4, and considerably less inputs, the break even on that corn is 77 bushels an acre. So I think in a 2-year average, if I could get that first year with a respectable and considerably close to my cultivated 30-inch corn, and even if I took 125 or 150 bushel second year, that 2-year average would still be something, along with the ecosystem services of soil building, with the fact that I can put this corn, on hills and slopes that I don't currently put any row crop on. We haven't typically farmed into our headlands, because by the time we do that and drive it all down, our fields are pretty small. We don't get anything out of it, so we put pollinator or some sort of habitat in those headlands. this process will allow me to get the headland acreage back as well. So I think, there's a whole pot of beneficial components, to doing it, but still a lot to learn. So,
Gotcha. And what were the strips? How wide were they?
they're about a foot.
Okay.
They're about a foot.
Great.
And
Well,
that 108 bushel corn and the 204 bushel corn was done on less than 40 units of applied N. So, we did accomplish the grow your own nitrogen piece. So again, not one to always be chasing yield numbers as a yardstick. Profit per acre is a bigger driver, I think, for a lot of us, that are on the call today. So not alone there, but figuring that out and figuring out ways to also monetize or determine values for those other ecosystem services, as well as just, with the acres that we're doing, our fuel costs were cut in half, so there's, right now fuel is cheap, but when it gets back to $4 or $5 a gallon, which it probably will at some point in time, those are other benefits and long range advantages as well.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Well, thanks very much. That was really, really great to see kind of your experience with that. I think with that, we're going to transition to our next farmer presenter here, John Sather from Madison. Are you there, John?
I am. Can you hear me?
Awesome. Yeah, I can hear you. Let's get you going with.
Can I just bounce mine up there? I added a couple more slides quick.
Yeah, you bet.
We're gonna run yours. Okay.
Yeah, and if you could enable your video too, that'd be great, just so we can see you.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good. All right. Share. Okay, I had this working. Can you see my screen or no?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. Zoom. Share screen. Desktop. There we go.
Yep, we got you
How about now?
Yep.
All right. So, yeah, my first screen. Yeah, I'm from the organic farms. My wife and I should have put her name up there. She'd be upset if she didn't see it. We have 1,600 acres of certified organic land. We farmer in Southwest Minnesota, been farmer since '99. This year we had 1,200 acres of organic corn. We decided to jump in with 2 feet, and we did 900 acres.
Hey, John. Sorry to stop you. We're kind of running into a buffer. You're kind of freezing up on us, so maybe you want to start from the beginning, if you wouldn't mind. If we're having connectivity issues, I might have you call in on the phone, and then we can just advance your slides for you.
Yeah, my kids might be on Zoom because they don't have school. I can get them to shut that off too. So you can hear me okay now? Okay. I'm John Sather, Madison, Minnesota. We farm 1,600 acres up here. We have 900 acres of 60-inch corn this year. It's kind of our experiment. So the reason we decided to go with the 60-inch rows is mostly to improve soil health and focus on water infiltration in the regenerative problem with excess water, like most people did. Listen to some people like Gabe Brown and others talking about their water infiltration rates. That's what I want. So how do we get there, right? And one of the big things is working with cover crops. So how do we grow a cover crop in our corn while we're growing it? And a 60-inch rows made a lot of sense. Our goals are to reduce tillage, potential of raising corn on corn, which other people have talked about, reducing on our manure inputs, trying to raise nutrients through legumes, especially and increase profit, which doesn't necessarily mean increase bushels, which is some people have a hard time understanding. So what we did is we went out and I sold my John Deere planter, went out and bought me a Monosem planter. It's a twin row machine. And this is just a picture of before and after, I guess. We started with a 12 row 36-inch machine and made it an 8 row 60. If I did it over, I would get a 12 row 38 machine. We had to add on to the frame a little bit, but it still worked. Yes, why Monosem? So what we want to do is we want to get the plants as far as apart as possible, but still, you know, with a wide center or a wide so in theory, it'll plant them, you know, farther apart, but evenly. It worked pretty good. We found out too that we were thinking about it when we go 60-inch rows, we want to keep the same population, and to do that, you'd have to have your plants about 3 inches apart. Well, to get a planter to plant that fast, you'd have to drive much slower to make it do a good job. By having 2 rows doing the same job, we can plant at 5 miles an hour. We're trying to optimize our light access to it too, by, you know, having them a little farther apart, thinking that they'll get different angles of light from the sun, I guess. So technically we have 52 inches between our rows where we can drive in. So we swapped out our machinery, had to move some stuff around, didn't really plan on doing this till the last minute. So all these things got done right before they needed to be used, which was a poor planning on my part. But so we took a Danish Tine alloy cultivator. We added, I believe it was 5 shanks to each gang. Then we took our flame weeder and we made it so that it would go down 60-inch rows as well. The first time across, we broadcast over the top. The second time we banded. This is set up for banding right here. And on the far right side, we have a 787 air seeder. It was a 730 air drill behind it originally. We converted that to essentially a central fill 455 grain drill by taking off the field cultivator part. And from there, we switched it to this, where we put a 3-point hitch in the back of on the seed tender or the seed tank, and took a cultivator bar and mounted the units to that to make our seeder. Whoops. Okay, advance. There we go. So planning, we have it set up for variable rate planning. We planted fields everywhere from 17,000 population to 50,000 just to try things. Our seed around for sensor, know what kind of job we were doing with it. The smart farmers were really interesting. We got to see our organic matter as we went, to soil temperature and soil moisture as on the go. And then a turkey manure, which is a little bit less than we usually do, but we've been slowly weaning ourselves off manure as much as possible. So that's about 50 pounds available nitrogen, we figured. So our process was we field cultivated the manure in before planting. We waited a day to let the ground dry up before we planted it. We broadcast flame at V4. This is how we do it every year in our 30-inch corn too. Then we Danish Tine cultivated after about 5 days after we flamed it. There's been many years where we've gotten away with being done at that point, and our fields are very clean. This year we had a huge time, or about 4 weeks, where we didn't get really any ban flaming it and then cultivating it the next day. This is a picture of one of the fields where apparently our GPS width of our implement was set wrong, and so we missed a couple of rows. And you can kind of see what the fields would look like if we hadn't flame weeded it. We're big flame weeding proponents. We're doing it for 18 years, and we just see excellent results with it, especially weed control wise. But yeah, that strip didn't get cultivated or flamed prior to, I mean, it hasn't been touched since it's been planted. So this is the it was only oriented towards legumes to produce nitrogen for the next year's crop. One thing I was a little disappointed is I think that we had so much fertility from the broadcasting of turkey manure that a lot of the legumes didn't put on a big nodules. They essentially used the manure or the nitrogen that was there. In the future, if I could figure out a way to ban my manure, I think it would be beneficial, because then it would make my legumes work a little harder to produce nitrogen for themselves. But we set it at a depth of a 1/4 inch, and we went 8 miles an hour, and it worked pretty well. We had some we planted a little bit deeper that really only the cowpeas and what else was it? Some of the buckwheat, but mostly just the cowpeas grew. It really got it too deep, but the 1/4 inch seemed to work well. This is what it looks like. We got it planted a little bit later than we wanted to, because we had to do that second cultivation. This and then another picture in the top right corner is the inner seeder again. And we put 900 metric tires on our Massey to run this. You know, large tires you're cultivating or you're doing any type of you know, pass through the field, because there's such a wide road that we can put big tires on, and we do that for reduction and compaction. Otherwise, we use tractors typically, but we just wanted to try something different. Here's a picture of the inner seeding. I got to get this out of the way. I can hit play on this. Turn the volume off here. It's just a quick little video of us interseeding. We're cruising. That's what it looks like on the go. This is actually interseeded at 60-inch sunflowers, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. Harvest, we used a Drago and a John Deere chopping corn head. We turned the choppers off later, or partly over the row, because I wanted to leave as much stock in the row where it grew as possible, because if I'm going to put corn between the rows next year, I didn't want the residue over there. Not sure if that's the right idea or not, or the right thing to do, because a lot of this is just experiment, right? Because we're so just learning as we go. And then the cover crops we planted had very little, or didn't have any overwintering varieties. Now you can see the radish and the annual ryegrass really perked up. Actually, annual ryegrass continues to green up about every day. It's warm outside, so it's nice to see having a living plant still in the ground. We didn't do cereal rye because I'm not really sure how to manage it in the spring. I think eventually we want to try and figure out how to do that, but for now that's not what we're doing. This is after harvest, or at harvest. On the left side, there is some big radishes. We found the stuff we planted later actually did better, because it's kind of died off. But on the right side, you can see that's the annual ryegrass and some radishes in the sunflower fields that we had already combined. But these radishes were in late planted corn, and it had lower population.
Hey, John, there was a question that came in about the cost of the turkey manure in your area.
Yeah, so we have a pretty big, quite a bit of access to turkey manure in our area. There's a lot of barns around us. Right now, I think it's roughly $38 a ton spread on our field. It's not terribly expensive, but you know, we used to spread all our own, which was a lot of work, but these guys have their own setup, and so they come out and spread it for us. So yeah, it's $38 a ton for that. So
yeah, and you're still a little choppy. I think
does that answer your question?
Yeah, you did, definitely. I think you're still, connection's a little choppy, but I think we're all picking up the gist of what you're talking about here.
Okay. All right. So I'll try and get my wife to shut off all the kids' Zooms here in a little bit if I can, if we're having problems still, but they get out of school, right? So what we've learned or observed with our cover crops is we want to plant as early as we can after V3, hoping we get some rain. just to get the corn a little head start. I mean, this is my theory. I don't know if it's accurate or not. Sun hemp, cowpeas, and buckwheat, they were the early dominating species. Our clovers didn't do well at all. The plant health was very impressive all year. I was surprised, and we really had no insect problems. I think we put pollinator species in like Phacelia and then buckwheat too, and that seemed to keep a lot of insects in our field, which actually, attack the beneficials, attack the predator or the other insects, and so we're really happy with our insect control. And then we noticed where there were spots where there's no corn, whether it be drowned out or cultivator blight or whatever it may be. The cover crops really just took over and kept the weeds out. Yields overall, to be honest, they were 10 to 20% lower in a 60-inch corn. So if you're talking 200 bushel corn, we're giving up, 40 bushels in spots. Typically, well, this year we had very low rainfall. On our plat, we only had 7 inches of rain during the growing season, and we'll get to those results in a little bit. But I think this one, sunflowers did wonderful in the 60-inch situation. Our populations, the really high populations, was about a 6 bushel loss or lower. In ultra low populations, I was very it went over 100 bushel, and I couldn't believe it because the cover crops were lush and green, and the corn, it wasn't tall, but it had big ears on it, and it did really well. And typically I don't get much for corn over that sand ground. Also, we used some blue N from Syburg, I believe is the company, and we saw a 6 bushel increase over multiple trials on our farm, and so we plan on using that in the future too. It's a bacteria that gets into the plant. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in corn, and it makes it so that the corn can utilize nitrogen out of the atmosphere. It's kind of a new thing, but we tried that this year and we were pretty impressed. This is our yield or our plot we had. So it kind of shows you where things are at. This was planted east and west. I would say if I did it over, I would plant all my corn north and south. We noticed that the ears on the north side of the rows were smaller than the ones on the south side, and that the cover crop grew better in the north-south rows than the east-west ones. And Viking's not even paying me to do this, but they actually won the plot with their variety here. But it was good. So otherwise, that's about it. There's a lot more I could talk about. I would say I'm definitely not an expert on 60-inch corn. I would say that we learned a lot, and we have a lot of different ideas for next year. We're going to do about half of our corn next year, I think, in wide row corn. Just to do a lot more trials and get some more information before we decide that's like the only way to do things, I guess. So, and that's all I got.
In your twin rows, what's the actual spacing between the seeds or the plants after all is said and done?
It's like 9 inches. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So I lost my cursor here, so I don't know how to get it off here, but.
Oh yeah, no problem. Well, thank you very much, John. I appreciate your contributions and sharing your, it's folks like you and Sandy that are, out there pushing the envelope that give all of us really great information to go off of. So I think with that, that's a great transition space to go to Dr. Joel Gruver from Western Illinois University, get him on board here and started. And then Joel, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So let me see what we need here. So I just turned on the video.
Yep.
And now I'm going to share screen. Okay, so you should see my screen. Is everything working?
Yep, we see it up here.
Okay, so we typically use the term solar corridor corn rather than 60-inch corn because we don't just use that spacing. We have done 60-inch corn and we did some this past year, but we also do other configurations. So we refer to it as solar corridor corn, and I'll spell that out for in just a minute. But our goals are broad in terms of why we're looking at this system, but improving nitrogen fixation in season and enhancing weed management would be two of the main priorities. My number one priority is developing young ag professionals in the School of Ag at Western Illinois University. So if anybody's looking for an undergraduate program or even taking a class online, I've never done that before, but I'm learning how to do that right now. So maybe we will increase our offerings online in the future. So weed control and adequate nitrogen supply are often identified as two of the greatest challenges faced by producers of organic corn. And I think that solar corridor planting systems have the potential to address both of these issues. And basically, we're doing more strategic plant spacing, adjusting both in row and between row. And then we also need to think about complementary practices that should be adjusted when we change the spacing of our corn. Some key concepts, and this is just a review. Solar corridors are gaps between corn rows that are wider than traditional row spacing. They occur at regular intervals across the solar corridor planting system field. They could be every other row, 60-inch spacing, or they could be every third row, or even potentially some other configuration. But you still keep relatively standard or near standard corn populations. So you might be packing 2 rows of corn into 1 or 3 rows of corn into 2. Those are the systems we have looked at. We have some basic hypotheses that we're trying to test. One would be closer in-row spacing of corn plants in our solar corridor planting systems increases competitive advantage over weeds without causing excessive competition between the corn plants. Another hypothesis would be enhanced inter-row light penetration into our solar corridors increases biomass production and nitrogen fixation by intercropped legumes and also other cover crops during the corn production season. Another hypothesis, solar corridors improve crop health, both above and below ground, and facilitate targeted application of inputs, resulting in more efficient utilization of natural and applied resources. And what I mean by targeted application is application that might be indexed right to the row. Particularly if you have your rows farther apart, you are not having as many rows that you need to target. So there are some efficiencies there. So we've been looking at the solar corridor planting systems for 3 years, starting in 2018 at the WIU Organic Research Farm in Roseville, Illinois. It's about 15 miles north and west of the campus, the WIU campus. It's a farm that's been cash rented for about 30 years. It's flat black, poorly drained soils, and we do about 70 acres of row crop plots each year. So 2018, we had 4 treatments. We were comparing 30-inch versus 60-inch corn. On our 30-inch corn, we were interseeding cowpea on half of the plots, and we also have plots without the interseeding. And as I'll mention in just a second, the interseeding was after the corn was at about V5. The 60-inch corn we had also with and without the interseeded cowpea. This was an east-west row orientation, and we were targeting about 60,000 for the in-row spacing, or 30,000 across the field. So you could see that wiggly row of cowpeas. We originally had intended to use a modified drill to plant the cowpeas, but the corn got a little too big because of some timely rains. The corn took off and just was too big to get through with our drill. So we used a 1-row push planter to plant several miles of the cowpeas. This corn had been cultivated 1 time. We had excellent cowpea biomass production. in the 60-inch corn and decent cowpea biomass production in the 30-inch corn. Cowpeas are quite shade tolerant, and as far as a warm season legume that can grow at the same time as corn, they are pretty impressive. The 60-inch corn ended up yielding a little more than 20% less than the 30-inch corn, but the yields were still a little over 150 bushels per acre, and we grew a tremendous amount of cowpea biomass. We also looked at the impact the following season. We planted oats, and what I'm showing here are the actual oat biomass yields with and without following the cowpea. And basically we picked up significant more oat biomass where we were following cowpea. So there was a legacy effect, probably mostly a nitrogen effect, that improved oat biomass the next season.
Hey, Joel.
Yes.
Just a point of clarification. Are cowpeas the same as black-eyed peas, or are they different?
Yeah, black-eyed peas are a type of cowpea. Cowpeas are very, very diverse. There are lots of different types, and they range from bush to very viney. And the iron clay cowpea are probably the most widely used as a cover crop. They're a forage cowpea, and they are really viney. And basically, they will not bloom until the very end of the season, if at all, in the Midwest to upper Midwest. So you don't have any risk of them maturing seed in the Midwest.
Got it. Thank you.
In the following season, 2019, we did a large-scale experiment where we were planting blue corn simultaneously with forage soybeans. We had 3 treatments. These were 6-row plots, and we had all blue corn with banded humate. We had all blue corn without the humate, and then we had the blue corn with forage soybeans, and it was 2 rows of corn to 1 row of forage soybeans. East-west row orientation, target population for the corn was 45,000, and for the beans was 128,000. And basically, we were using a 1760 planter, and we just put in the 40-hole corn discs and the 108-hole bean discs, and then set the planter transmission to get the 45K for the corn, and that dropped to 128 for the beans. It was a really simple system, uniform management across the whole field after planting. With the corn planted at 45,000, we had faster in-row canopy development, but we really did achieve a high level of weed control across all the plots, and this got cultivated 2 times, and I think rotary hoed 2 times. One thing that we noticed that was only a temporary problem, but there was channeling of airflow down between the corn where we had left out a corn row, and those solar corridor soybeans had some dicamba injury, and that was very prevalent in our area on non-dicamba beans, but it was something that just was very temporary effect, and the beans recovered. We ended up with the solar corridor corn yielding about 13% less than where we had all corn, but we grew a lot of soybean biomass, and it was a very simple system to manage. We feel that we were definitely short on nitrogen. There was only 1 ton of pelletized litter applied, so that was a pretty modest nitrogen program, only 50 to 60 pounds of applied N. We did a small nitrogen study in the field, and we picked up additional corn yield with the sidedress nitrogen. And the first column where it says bushels per acre, that would be just the in-row yield, and then the corrected would be where we adjusted for the fact that we were leaving out one of the corn rows. So you can see we had better yields with the 30-inch corn, all corn, than where we had the solar corridors. And we picked up a bigger yield boost with side dress nitrogen in the solar corridor corn. One of the key things when you reduce the when you make light less likely to be a limiting factor, then other factors become more of the limiting factors. And so I think when you're packing corn plants close together, you need to focus more on making sure that you have enough fertility, especially nitrogen fertility. That season, 2019, we also did some interseeded cowpea at V5. And there you can see a view of that. And the cowpeas grew okay, but there was no comparison in terms of biomass production. We had about 90% less cowpea biomass production under the 30-inch corn as compared to the forage soybeans planted at the same time as the corn. The forage soybeans planted every third row at the same time into the, with the blue corn produced about 1,600 pounds of dry matter per acre, or that works out to about 65 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The forage soybeans that we planted a few weeks later without corn produced about twice as much dry matter. So there's definitely a shading effect. The corn dominates over the soybeans, but the soybeans are still quite productive. And as I said before, cowpeas interseeded into 30-inch corn at V5, they hang on, but they don't produce nearly the biomass as the forage soybeans planted at the same time as corn. We've experimented with a few other things on a small scale. We did popcorn, where we used the 2-to-1 configuration popcorn with various interseeded crops and cover crops. You can see pumpkins here interseeded, and we had a pretty decent pumpkin crop actually on the small scale that we did this. So this past season, we had 2 solar corridor studies. One was a larger scale study where the plots were about 1,200 feet long, 16 plots. Each plot was 6 rows. We had 4 treatments, replicated 4 times. This was a north-south row orientation system with the 2-to-1 configuration. We'll talk about that more in just a second. We also had a smaller scale study with a 1-to-1 configuration. So this is the 60-inch corn, east-west row orientation, 8 plots that were 6 rows, and they were a little less than 500 feet long. Just 2 treatments replicated 4 times. And this is intended, the smaller study is intended to be a multi-year experiment, and we'll discuss that more in just a second. So our larger scale study, we were focusing on how can we address some of this yield gap that we have seen and most people report with their solar corridor corn. We wanted to look at basically 4 different things. If we get a better hybrid selection, if we try the north-south row orientation where you have more sunlight penetrating in the middle of the day, if we supply some supplemental N, especially indexed to the corn rows, and if we try terminating the cover crop, maybe we'll be able to see some reduced effect on yield compared to 30-inch corn. So we used a Great Harvest organic hybrid 63T1. I can't claim that that's the perfect hybrid for this system, but it was recommended by Great Harvest. We used the forage soybean, a variety called Dairy, the 2-to-1 configuration, and you can see the 4 treatments there. We had one 30-inch corn treatment where we didn't add supplemental N. Now there was nitrogen applied. 1 ton of pelletized litter was applied in the spring, and the previous fall we had enough goat manure bedding pack that we probably got about 40 pounds of N. So overall, the nitrogen program was decent, but was not, none of these plots received a really high nitrogen program. And where it says chop, that's where we terminated the cover crops earlier in the season. We'll describe that in just a second. So the side dress nitrogen, we used a product called Nature Safe. 1300. It's a pelletized feather meal. We applied it when the corn was quite small at about V2. And that was basically, we wanted to get that in before we would do a cultivation. That was applied to just one of the 2 all corn treatments. We used that same product in the solar corridor plots. We actually reduced the nitrogen rate. So what we did is we applied 2/3 of the rate because we were only planting 2 out of 3 corn rows. And we basically, we brought all of the product into right between the 2 corn rows rather than delivering it uniformly across the 6 rows. In early August, we used a 1-row stock chopper to terminate the soybeans in one of the 2 solar corridor treatments. And so you can just see here what it looked like. This was a homemade machine. A local farmer built it many years ago for some work he was doing with seed corn, and it did a great job of terminating the cover crops. But you can see how big the forage soybeans were when we ran the chopper. This is some effect on weed abundance, and this data is just from one specific part of the field. We actually had very good weed control in this field, and weeds tend to be patchy in their distribution. So it's sometimes hard to quantify weed pressure. We had one part of the field that had some flooding and it had higher weed pressure. So we went there and we counted the number of foxtail stems per row foot. And basically we saw where we had the solar corridor corn that was planted at about 50% higher population, 45K versus 30K, we had less in-row foxtail. Overall, across the field, we had very good weed control, but we saw there was a benefit to having that higher population with the solar corridor corn. Also, of course, when you're cultivating and rolling soil into the row, it's really helpful to have that wall of corn plants that are close together. So here are some yields. We are doing things at a large enough scale that it's hard for us to do everything with a weigh wagon because there's just too much. Basically, one round in the field is too much corn to put into a weigh wagon. So we did one replication of the 4 treatments with a weigh wagon. We had to deadhead back a quarter mile. So that's not something we can do on all of our plots. But you could see here where we had just the straight corn, 2 of those treatments that are on the left. They did have the highest yields, but where we had the solar corridor corn that had the chopped cover crop, it wasn't too far behind where we had the corn without the sidedress nitrogen. And then the solar corridor corn that had the cover crop growing all the way the full season, there was a yield hit there. And this is just one replication I'm showing you. This is where we had the weigh wagon weight, so I feel the most confidence in those yields. Let's take a look at some yield monitor data. This is an average of 3 reps of yield monitor data. We actually had 4 reps. One of them, the yield monitor data is really compromised. We're still working on how to deal with that. Yield monitor data, is very valuable, but you need to work with it to really understand what's going on. And so we are still working on this yield monitor data, adjusting it, obviously, for correcting it with the weigh wagon weights, but we're also looking at some other things that we can do with the yield monitor data. Because we have basically high resolution variation in yield, we can look at that and adjust for maybe some problematic areas. The solar corridor corn happened to have some wet holes in some of the plots, and so maybe we can understand those implications by studying the yield monitor data a little more closely. Any of you who are working with yield monitors know that you have various things that happen when you have starting and stopping, things that impact the grain flow rate, and that changes the way your yield monitor is sensing. And so it's really important to this is straight from Purdue. They have a recent publication called Identifying and Eliminating Gremlins from Yield Monitor Data, just to kind of show that this is the straight yield monitor data. And then once it has been cleaned, it actually looks like that. So there's the straight and there's where it has been cleaned. So you can see some different patterns, you know, same basic pattern, but some differences where the starting and stopping delays have been adjusted for. So what we are just in the early stages of doing, working with one of my students that's a GIS specialist now, we are mapping out the plots across this field. The yield monitor data that you see there is not our real yield monitor data. It's from the Purdue publication, but I'm just showing you how we are going about this. We're going to map out the individual plots, and then we'll look at subplots across the field where we have basically the ability to make comparisons across the treatments, many different places across the field. And we'll do this in a randomized way, so we're not targeting certain areas to, you know, bias the result. But this will allow us to deal with the fact that we did have some extreme weather, some very wet weather early on and very dry weather later. And so we'll be able to take out some of the bad areas and look for the treatment effects more closely across the field. Our smaller scale study, our goal is to make this a multi-year study where we move the corn back and forth 30 inches. So this was a 60-inch study, and we had 2 treatments where we were alternating corn with cover crops. One of the systems was the low diversity system where the cover crop was just forage soybeans every other row. And then we had a high diversity system where we had 4 different cover crops. And I'll talk about that more in just a second. It was an east-west row orientation system. And our target was 60,000 for the corn population, 162,000 for the soybean or cover crop population. I am very embarrassed to admit this, but we had a terrible error with our planting. This was basically we planted all the corn plots in one day on this farm, and the corn got planted at 162,000 and the beans got planted at 60,000, or the cover crops. And we were absolutely horrified when we discovered this. We ended up chopping out the corn down to a 60,000 population. So we removed about 2/3 of the corn plants, and that was a brutal process, but we really didn't, this was already June 3rd when we were planting. For the first time, we did not want to till up the field and try and plant again. So we chopped out the corn population down to where we wanted it to be. And it definitely compromised the results for 2020, but it also allowed us to establish our system that we can continue to look at over multiple years. So here you can see the 4-way mix of sun hemp, forage soybean, cowpea, and sunflower. It grew great, even though it had a lower population than we intended. Here you can see running the chopper. We chopped the 4-way mix in early August, and then the low diversity system, which was just the forage soybean, we actually ended up mowing that just a couple days later. But we wanted to look at 2 different ways of terminating the cover. So we had a little mower that we used, the same little tractor that you can see pulling the chopper here. That's what it looked like after the chopping had been done. And right before chopping, we seeded a diverse cool season cover crop mix: balanza clover, crimson clover, radish, rapeseed, annual ryegrass, and flax. I actually did that by hand, but we do have a little Gandy box set up so we can run that on the tractor right as we are chopping, if we do that in the future. So the idea is that the corn will be planted right in the middle, right where we had the cover crop row. The corn will be planted right there in 2021, just moving over 30 inches. Where we mowed off the soybeans, I actually came back and used a push planter I do too much push planting sometimes, but we plant survivor winter peas first week of September. And I'll show you what those look like in just a second. So we actually had excellent establishment of the survivor winter peas. They had a lot of growth in the fall, and I'm pretty confident that they will overwinter. We ended up with a weak stand of the diverse cool season mix that basically got incorporated while we were chopping. And that was mainly, I think, because it just was so dry. We had about 2 months where we had only about 1/4 of normal precipitation. So our diverse cool season mix did not establish well, but our survivor winter pea that I push planted in early September did establish very well. Here you can see some yields. The yields are not great, but they're actually better than I was imagining they might end up. Most of the field was planted to a hybrid from Byron Seeds, or I should say Master's Choice, Kingfisher 58C30. And then, as you might imagine, when you're planting almost 3 times the intended population, you run out of seed. So we had to throw some other seed into the corn boxes. And so we actually, because of that mistake, got to see an interesting difference. The Great Harvest 63T1, which we used in our other solar corridor study, really responded poorly to being planted at such a super high population and then getting thinned. But we ended up with a clear yield hit where we had the 4-way mix that included 3 legumes, but also sunflowers. And I think the sunflowers really had a negative effect on the corn. The low diversity system had a higher yield, and that was just the forage soybean. I think in the future we'll try more high diversity mixes, but we'll leave out sunflowers for sure. So to date, we focus primarily on the above ground components of the solar corridor study. Solar corridor story. We are also soil sampling, and we're trying to figure out some of the interesting effects on nitrogen dynamics, microbial activity, soil aggregate properties, but we have very little data on that yet. I think there are all sorts of interesting research possibilities. One of the most important things that needs to be quantified is just how much value is there from the extra biomass that's being grown when you can grow that biomass in a solar corridor during the corn season. Maybe we won't be able to eliminate a small yield hit consistently, but if we can quantify the value of that extra biomass grown during the season, either its value for grazing or its value for fertilizing the next crop, providing nitrogen to the next crop. In the upper right is a very interesting kind of mistake that a neighbor made. The neighbor that we rent the corn planter from, he ended up planting his normal little sweet corn plot in a field that had actually just been planted to soybeans. So you could see the sweet corn planted right across the soybeans there, and surprisingly, the sweet corn did very well. I went out and harvested some sweet corn, so that's what you're seeing in the upper right. In the bottom, there's a father and son pair in Ohio that we have interacted with, and they did 60-inch corn on a large scale in Ohio, not quite what John Sather did, but hundreds of acres. And they had very extreme drought this summer, but they actually are pretty pleased with their results for their first time using 60-inch corn. So with that, I think I'll stop and we'll take any questions, and I guess we can have questions for all 3 of us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joel. Appreciate that roundup of all of your work. I can say again, just from my own perspective, it's really helpful to have all of you kind of on the forefront of this and taking those steps and helping us all learn from those experiences. There was a question about your particular study, Joel, from I think it was the previous solar corridor with the cowpea interseeded, and you had strip applied some N, and that was 33 pounds of N. Was that 33 pounds of total N, or was that 33 pounds of that feather meal material that you applied?
It was 33 pounds. So that was our larger scale experiment this past season, 2020. It was about just under 300 pounds of actual product, which worked out to 33 pounds of total N. About 90% of that N is normally available from this feather meal product. And basically we used 2/3 of the rate that we applied to the plots where we had all the rows planted to corn. So that's where the 33 pounds, that's 2/3 of 50 pounds. That's where that came from.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, and it's interesting. I in kind of our introductory stages to getting into cover crop mixes for this specific system, maybe more so on narrow row corn, like 30-inch row corn. I think the focus of species was more on annual ryegrass, brassicas, small seeded clovers, things like that. But it seems like there's a analogous thread through all three of you that, the species that are really gaining the most benefit from the solar corridor work are those warm season legumes and warm season species that can really capture that, the extra sunlight and the heat of being interplanted and have that space to fill out.
Yeah, those are the species that can really put on biomass during the summer. Cowpeas, sun hemp, forage soybeans, all can grow very well during the summer, and they just need more light. So if you give them a solar corridor, they can grow very well. The cool season species, basically you're getting them started, and then they potentially can make good use of the fall. Excuse me, good use of the fall window of opportunity. But that all depends on what your weather is like in the fall. But they potentially can provide good forage by putting on a lot of growth as the summer crop comes to an end.
Mm-hmm. For Sandy and John, are you folks? John, sounds like you're continuing on with your scaling up of this practice. Sandy, you got some ideas as well. If you had to pick one thing out of maybe a lot that you would change, what would it be? I think you're muted, John.
What would I do differently is the question mostly, or?
Yeah, right.
I'd do a few things differently. Number one, I'm gonna lower my populations a little bit, I think. I'm gonna try and figure out my fertility north and south. That'd be the big things.
Okay, yeah, you cut out a little bit, but it sounds like orientation north and south and cutting your total plant population down in the row. Is that accurate?
Yeah, correct. And then also I'm trying to get my fertility more localized.
So what planting population are you shooting for, do you think?
Last year we set most of it at 36,000. That's kind of what we do our 30-inch corn at. I think that we could probably get similar results at 32,000, or probably better results maybe.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, Sandy, how about you?
Yeah, I would probably, my thoughts are probably looking at potentially different hybrids, versus messing with population right now, just to manage variables a little bit differently. Not being a scientist, but the variety that I have been using on 30-inch corn, is I think, it's Vikings terminology that it's a racehorse, right? On high fertility ground, it does really well. But I think when it gets into this competition thing, it may be a little bit too flexy. I'm not sure. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably going to leave my populations where they are and run some side-by-side, variety trial differences. And then, if I'm going to try and stay with this living isle system, so I'm kind of combining sort of the solar corridor and the living isle, I have to experiment with some of the the different covers that I would establish, those perennial covers, whether they're clovers or other perennials. Yeah, and then like John's saying, we've toyed around with some strip tilling. So instead of just running that rotavator to freshen a strip, potentially concentrate some fertility in that row, with some strip till equipment. Again, that's been sort of the last resort, trying to grow as much as what I can, without those additional inputs, keep the cost of production at an absolute minimum.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely, with, hybrid choice, I think that's going to be a big factor. That's, maybe something that, like Mac mentioned at the beginning, that we're going to have to kind of learn along with you folks about what varieties, just like we're learning what varieties are going to work in an organic no-till system, what organic corn hybrids are going to be conducive to, maybe a little bit more competition, or maybe appropriately the right kind of flex, whether it's, a true flex year or kind of a semi-flex, or, all those things I think definitely will, come into play. I would suspect that maybe like a hybrid, like 4597 might fit that bill for you specifically, Sandy, but it's hard to say. I think this is going to be something we're going to have to learn along with all of you innovators out in front there. I was curious if anybody had any inputs on, there's a question about, stockpiling this type of system for grazing. Would you have a sense, anybody, about, what the grazing potential of a, cover crop mix and corn stalks would be of this type of system if you had animals?
I guess I would just say, I think there's the potential to have substantially more cover crop biomass. I mean, we are seeing, 5 to 10 times more biomass in solar corridors as compared to cover crops interseeded into 30-inch corn. So I think, and anybody who is currently flying on cover crops into corn and then grazing after corn harvest has the potential to have substantially more cover crop biomass and quality of grazing. So that's where maybe there's the greatest opportunity for this system to really compensate for the yield hit in corn that we haven't resolved yet. I think we made a little progress on that this year. I think we need to find the right hybrid. We saw some substantial differences in terms of how different hybrids performed in our systems. And I think the 60-inch corn, the alternating rows, is it's the simplest system maybe, but it may not be the lowest risk system. Having 2 rows out of 3, packing 3 rows of corn into 2, I think is maybe lower risk, that more hybrids would be adaptable to that. And you can get big benefits in terms of weed control by packing 3 rows into 2. I think planting your cover crops at the same time as your corn is very nice in terms of simplicity. And if you plant them on 30-inch rows, you continue with your same management practices for cultivation, and the whole system works really slick. It doesn't require the specialized equipment that people like John have developed. I mean, it's really impressive to see that, but I think more people can dip their toe into this without having to build specialized equipment.
Mm-hmm. Now, Joel, I know both Sandy and John used 8495, which is a little bit more of a fixed year hybrid. It can have some length flex, but we're both the hybrid, not familiar with Master's Choice and Great Harvest as much. Are both of those flex year hybrids or more fixed yeared, or where do they fit?
They're more flex, and I think we may be kind of going in the wrong direction. Somehow I was under the impression, and I think the agronomists with the seed companies were under the impression that you wanted a high level of flex. But I think when you're packing corn plants close together, maybe the fixed are more appropriate for that.
And there's
I would
some,
like to
oh yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to say, when we got started with this, we talked to Bob Recker. He's a big name in 60-inch corn, and he kept saying never use a fixed ear. And I'm not saying I know, but that's why we went with semi-flex as much as possible, or we were looking for full flex too. But back to the cover, the grazing aspect of it. One of our goals is to do a lot more grazing. We have a few cattle, not enough to cover the land, but I think we'll put like turnips in. So like now we're seeing like the annual ryegrass and the radishes are pretty well died off, but I think the turnips would do better later if I'm not mistaken. But there is a lot of grazing for them out there. So I think if somebody's looking for more grazing, that the 60-inch or the wide row corn has a lot of potential.
Yeah, definitely. There's some discussion to that effect too about, timing of seeding some species too. And I would agree with that. If you're planning on seeding later, those cool season species could definitely have a, potentially more growth there. So in the last 5 minutes, I'll just try to summarize there's some discussion going on here. There's some people kind of weighing in with just observations of having tried this, that, thinking about crop rotation would be really important with this system. What's coming next? Some folks have tried out hairy vetch, seeded at the same time as planting corn and 60-inch corn. That did very well. Another gentleman, don't know where these are located, but seeded annual ryegrass, buckwheat, cowpea, and berseem clover and plantain at last cultivation, with the plantain and the ryegrass having the best feed value after harvest. And that was in a wider row corn scenario versus a 30-inch. Another gentleman used a very fixed hybrid in a 60-inch corn last year. Had about 20% reduction in yield versus the 30-inch row. So yeah, this is an interesting question about ear flex. I mean, if someone were to call me up and have me pick a hybrid for this system, I would absolutely encourage them to pick a flex ear hybrid, but that's just a guess, like maybe that's not the right answer.
I think there's a lot to be learned, but I also think that I think we can get to the point where there's so many variables. But I was very impressed with our plant health, with our soil moisture, even in a dry year, with the cover crops growing, protecting the soil, and the standability in wind was amazing. We had major wind here, and our corn did not tip over. Of ours did more, and neighbors did definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with that extra growing space, I would imagine that those plants are probably half again as deeper rooted. The rooting system is much more extensive than your 30-inch row spacing. Let me see here. So, I think we're going to kind of scale to the end of this conversation. We really appreciate everybody being involved, all of our speakers. Thank you for taking the time and being involved in this. And thank you to everybody that's on. This has been a great discussion. I hope this has been a worthwhile time for you, and you found some helpful tidbits for you as you're kind of planning for next year and thinking through everything. Again, I did want to say, whoops. Sorry about that. Just as another call out, we have a couple more of days exactly like this coming up in February. So mark your calendars for February 3rd for our Forages Day, same format over Zoom with speakers and discussion like we've had today. And then February 4th, 2021, there's going to be a talk specifically on small grains. So in the meantime, hope you and your families are all staying healthy and safe, and we'll hopefully see you in person next year. So take care.